Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this, our final panel of this week on monumental photography, investigating representations of colonialism and nationalism. The purpose of this panel is to use this exhibition that you're sitting in here with photographs by Ziyah Gafic and Tomas van Houtryve as a platform for thinking about issues of power, colonialism, nationalism, architecture, symbolism, etc., etc. And we've got two fantastic presentations from people who have written and researched in these areas. On my right is Sary Zananiri, who's a cultural theorist and an artist himself. He has published extensively on Palestine and work about representations of Palestine. He's currently writing a monograph called Photographing Biblical Modernity, Frank Shelton in British Mandate Palestine, which is due, I think, in September and will probably therefore be out next year. He has also edited a series of collections including Imaging and Imagining Palestine, Photography, Modernity and the Biblical Lens, and European Cultural Diplomacy and Arab Christians in Palestine Between Contention and Connection. On my left is Jonathan Long, a professor from Durham University and director of the Center of Visual Arts and Culture, who has written on photographic theory, German photography of the early 20th century, and I'm happy to say that we used to be colleagues many years ago at Durham in the Durham Center for Advanced Photography Studies. Sary is going to be talking about issues around Ziyah's project, and Jonathan is going to be talking about issues around Thomas's project, and Ziyah and Thomas are with us, and after the presentations we will bring them up to join the conversation. While it's not a critique of their show, it's using their shows as a platform for consideration of these issues. We think it's going to be really interesting to hear their perspectives on these analyses and their issues, and of course we will make time for questions and conversation with the audience, both in the room and online. So, Sary, I think, Maciek, you want me to screen share?
Wonderful. Thank you, David, and thank you to Ziyah for the wonderful conversation a couple of weeks ago. Hold it a bit closer. All right. I've titled this talk Beyond Monumentality, and one of the reasons for this is understanding the significance of buildings such as this that go beyond something like the context of bricks and mortar, but thinking about them more as structures that have histories, that have impacts on people's lives, and that have a context and a framework of cultural heritage that involves a lived experience. One of the things, particularly in this current moment with the horrific news coming out of Palestine, is also sort of thinking not just about the destruction of heritage, but also the ways in which heritage actually permeates people's lives on a day-to-day basis. Indeed, the International Council of Monuments and Sites released a report in February of this year saying that more than 200 of the 350 heritage sites in Gaza have either been severely damaged or entirely destroyed, marking an erasure of almost 60% of cultural heritage. And so with that in mind, I want to think a little bit more about this building, its the ways in which it kind of holds a presence within the world, and also what that does in terms of local communities, what that does in terms of generating a visual culture, what that does in terms of vernacular aesthetics within a city like Jerusalem. Now, Palestine is a very photographed place. Indeed, the first photograph was taken in 1839 in Jerusalem. That photograph doesn't exist anymore, but this one from a few years later certainly does, by Jérôme de Prangy. The Dome of the Rock is just such a central image in this city. It stands out. When you're in that city, it is very difficult to not see this amazing building. But also, it's a site which has many layers. And certainly when we start thinking about the ideologies that surround such sites, we have a whole series of confluences that start to go on. Here is a triptych by Auguste Salzmann, a French photographer, taken in the 1850s, this one in 1854. Salzmann was one of the first people to really make a very significant camera study of Jerusalem. And he's a particularly interesting photographer because he was thinking about photography through this lens of archaeology. And within this, he was trying to prove many of the theories of an amateur archaeologist, Félix Cagnard de Saulcy, who had a series of claims that the remnants of Jerusalem dated from the time of Solomon rather than from the Roman period. Most of his claims have proved to be untrue, but it shows the power of photography in terms of the ways in which we can start to conceive of the landscape, and also the power of photography in terms of remediating a far-off space to colonial centres. One of the things that I find most interesting about this triptych is actually not the images themselves, but the captioning. And as you can see, he very specifically uses the word temple here. So already in the 1850s, we have this contention over this site that's going on. And, you know, I think this really starts to bring into question some of the sort of ways in which academia, scholarship, and supposedly scientific research frame a particular space. When we think about other examples of, imagery, we've got this wonderful photo from the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem, which was produced by the Palestine Exploration Fund. Indeed, the Palestine Exploration Fund, which was a British endeavour, was created as part of the production of this survey. Captain Charles Wilson was the Royal Engineer who was in charge of this project. He's another interesting character in the sense that he was also linked to British military intelligence. His histories of surveying of this of Jerusalem and the survey of Western Palestine, which was produced a year later, essentially laid out the boundaries for what would become Palestine in the 1920s under British rule. One of the things that starts to become interesting when we start to look at these photos as well is thinking about the ways in which this structure of the Dome of the Rock and the Haram al-Sharif enclosure more generally are just so central to the city. We start seeing this, these empty spaces around it. These spaces have often been criticised by scholars of photography, under this rubric of creating a narrative or playing into a later Zionist narrative that would develop of a land without people for a people without land. So, how do we understand, modernity and modern modes of thinking about these spaces as a sort of a framework that has much larger implications than just the photographs themselves? Certainly when we see images like this one, which is taken from Captain Arthur Rhodes' albums, we once again see similar tropes at play. Indeed, this view of the Dome of the Rock from the Mount of Olives would become such a common trope in so many different forums, from archaeology to surveying to touristic photos like this. This photo, incidentally, is taken on the 14th of December 1917. So this photo was taken 3 days after General Allenby captured Jerusalem and entered through Jaffa Gate, the old city. Indeed, at this point in time, Lloyd George, the former British Prime Minister at the time, had given Allenby directives to capture Jerusalem by Christmas. And when Jerusalem was captured by the British at the end of World War I, he proclaimed that Jerusalem was a great Christmas present to the British people. So we have a sense of how this structure sits within a sort of an international imaginary. And we have a sort of a sense of some of the documentation around it. This photograph is also from the Ordnance Survey of Jerusalem. And for those of you that may have visited, it might seem like quite an unusual photograph. What you perhaps can't tell is this area around here is the old Mughrabi quarter, the Moroccan quarter, which was established in the late 12th century. It was established to house the troops of Saladin, Salahuddin, who came from northern Africa. And part of this establishment of this ancient quarter was about kind of creating a waqf, a religious endowment, to look after the descendants of those people who had liberated the city. Of course, after the 1967 war, this site was erased and demolished, indeed 3 days after the Six-Day War. And this became a plaza for the Western Wall, and since then has been a very different space to what it was, but also one that has created a contention with a Jewish area sitting beside a Muslim one, in theory. Today, the space is controversially divided into a men's and a women's space. One of the first things that the British did when they entered Jerusalem was to very quickly start thinking about heritage, to start thinking about monuments, to start thinking about urban planning. And one of the sort of really interesting documents that came out of this period is Ernest Tatham Richmond's The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, a description of its structure and decoration. Tatham was linked to the Pro-Jerusalem Society, another Jerusalem-based British group that was dealing with a lot of these questions of urban planning. And this document in particular focuses on the Dome of the Rock and the various histories of restoration from the 16th to the 19th century. It particularly goes into details about the tile work. And for those of you who might not know so much about the history of the Dome of the Rock, it was originally actually covered in mosaics. And in the 16th century, the Ottomans created the tile work that is now much more familiar to us in this building. These tiles had repeated kind of restorations over the years, the most recent being in the 1920s by the British. And part of this was bringing Armenian tile workers from Kütahya in what is now modern Turkey in the aftermath of the genocides to work on these structures and fix these tiles. Several families came, the Ohanessians, the Balians, the Sandrunis, and in many ways this shifted Jerusalem's visual culture in a very interesting way, and ways that still impact on the way on the way we read the city now. One of the things that these British preservationist policies did was to regulate the frameworks of aesthetics in the old city. This involved mandating the use of Jerusalem limestone. It also meant that employments of craftspeople, not just ceramicists, but many other different craftspeople, became fundamental to the ways in which the city was restored, if we want to call it that. But it also involved demolishing of a lot of modern structures, shifts to, the urban fabric, taking a lot of modern buildings that were along the old city walls away, and repairs to various monuments. Other monuments were completely disregarded, like the Jaffa Great Clock Tower, which was demolished in 1924, or the Ottoman Sibyl, which was demolished in 1918. So there's a particular generation of this kind of imagery, but when we start thinking about the tile work and this centrality of this tile work in this day and age, it's hard to imagine that 100 years ago these tiles were not so visually present. All of these street signs came to be put up in the old city, and that's something that has been respected by all parties who've controlled the city since then. Here we have a more modern street sign, and when we compare this street sign to the older one, we can see in some ways that there's a shift in language preference. So we go here from English, Arabic and Hebrew to Hebrew, Arabic and then English. And so we can kind of see that in some ways there is a sort of a colonial marking that goes on through this sort of production of tile work, but this is much more about a dialogue between multiple groups of people in the former Ottoman Empire. Indeed, when we think about the influence of this tile work from these artisans who were brought specifically to deal with restorations of the Dome of the Rock, we see that even influencing modern Palestinian architecture. Here we have Dar Asaf Nashashibi in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem. It's one of the Palestinian cultural institutions in an area that was sort of a relatively posh Palestinian area. On the front of this building, which was finished in 1924, we can see not only the Jerusalem limestone, but also these tiles that were being sort of becoming a marker of affluence. You know, when we think about the ways in which these artisans who came to work on these tiles started to kind of find other avenues for their commerce, we can start to look at some of the souvenirs and the sort of studio ceramics that they were producing, drawing on ancient works. You know, here we have sort of statues that, although they're ceramic and painted in this beautiful Jerusalem ceramic style, they're actually drawn from archaeological finds that were being dug up at the time. We see gazelles, we see horses, we see, you know, cups with ram's heads. And so we can start to sort of, although these things in some ways look quite exotic and ancient, they're also very much modern products. And so we've got this tension that's going on. So when we're starting to think about this building, it's having more than an influence, you know, in terms of a sort of a religious life. It's actually having a real impact on the visual culture of this city and the way people are identifying in terms of building their own homes, or the ways in which people are trying to sort of produce a sort of a vision of an ancient past through souvenirs for tourists. Indeed, even to this day, we get funny little plaques like this at the Christmas Centre in the old city. But going beyond these sorts of you know, questions of visual culture, what does it mean to actually live around the Dome of the Rock? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Nabi Musa, which was a festival that was held yearly. It's an interesting festival in that it has it is a Muslim festival, but it's held on the Christian calendar. So it actually starts on the Saturday before Orthodox Palm Sunday. And so this is actually part of a sort of a nexus of religious festivities that would historically happen in the springtime. The original Prophet Moses festival was mostly celebrated in a shrine also called Nabi Musa, which was outside of Jericho. But in the 19th century, the festival started to take on new characteristics as the Ottoman Empire was going through its big processes of reforms. And so Jerusalem became the main center of celebration, and the most important flags and banners that were part of the festivities, which were very central to the festivities, were actually kept in Al-Aqsa, in the Haram Sharif compound. And so, you know, when we're starting to think about this sort of spring nexus of activities, this was quite a series of spectacles. So you have Nabi Musa and Easter, you have Pesach, you have the Jewish Passover, you have a whole series of different links that are going on. You also have Purim shortly thereafter. And these festivals would build through the springtime and culminate with Sitna Maryam, which is the, the Dormition of the Virgin Mary in English, the Dormition of the Virgin Mary festival, which was in the summertime. So when we're thinking about how all of these sort of parades and all of these pilgrims were functioning, you know, we can start to get a bit of a sense of how festive Jerusalem would have been at this particular moment. But also we start to understand, we start to understand how all of these pilgrims, both Muslim and Christian, arriving in Jerusalem at the same time might operate. One of the big Ottoman innovations in terms of the shifts in the festival was to essentially get pilgrims from various cities and towns to march and process to Jerusalem first. Everybody would meet in Jerusalem, and then from there process to Nabi Musa shrine. And this meant, in some ways, a regionalization of people, but also a centralization of Jerusalem, which really gives us much more of a sense of you know, the sort of political implications of that particular moment. One of the things that was also quite interesting about Nabi Musa is that it essentially had a two-tiered religious structure now under the Ottomans. It went from a series of Sufi practices that were very localized, that were very much a part of popular religion, to a more state-sponsored kind of mode of religion. And here we can see a whole series of pilgrims. These are pilgrims from Hebron and surrounding villages arriving at Jaffa Gate here. Indeed, you can also see at the top of the photograph the Jaffa Gate clock tower, which was demolished about 2 years after this photo was taken. So we get this sort of sense of people entering Jerusalem, but also a sense of Jerusalem as sort of a very urbanized center, being centered and reinforced through ritual. With the British taking over by the late 1917, early 1918, we also see the British assuming a role within the Nabi Musa festival. And here we can see Ronald Storrs, the military governor of Jerusalem, along with a series of Jerusalem's notables, including Ya'ul Bukhari, one of the most famous Sufis. And here, we're also kind of looking at this kind of moment when Nabi Musa itself and the sort of political situation in Palestine was shifting very rapidly, not just because of British colonialism, but because of the third Aliyah, the third Jewish migration, which set up a lot of the Zionist infrastructure. Indeed, in 1919, Khalil Sakakini, the Arab nationalist and educator, wrote in his diaries that the Nabi Musa celebration in Jerusalem is political, not religious. So we see this moment where a festival is transforming from a religious festival into something that's much more about a nationalist expression. And it's very hard to divide this from a building like that. But it also, in some ways, tells us so much more about a building in its much more expanded field. The Nabi Musa festival in 1920 would actually erupt into the first communal riot between Arab and Jewish communities. A handful of people would die and about 100 would be injured. But this also marks this particular moment of division and colonial division that would begin and that would really shape the course of 20th century politics in the region. Now, to think a little bit more broadly about some of the things that were going on at this moment, we have other Arab nationalists. Here we have Alfred Rock, who was actually a Catholic Palestinian. He was also an orange orchardist, a very wealthy orange grower, and a bohemian. He was somebody who was very close to the Husseini family. The Husseini family are one of the sort of leading notable families of Jerusalem, of Muslim background. They also produced the Grand Muftis of most of the Grand Muftis of Jerusalem, including the very controversial figure of Hajj Amin Husseini. But one of the things about Rock is that he's a very interesting fellow in that as much as he was a serious man of business and politics, he also had some great parties. And here, we see one of them every year in springtime at this nexus of Easter and Nabi Musa. He would hold one of these parties. And, this period, you can imagine with all of these religious events going on at the same time was a moment of heightened nationalism. And, here we see this wonderful Orientalist theme party. These costumes are very ballet russe, We see these sort of elites who are in cultural dialogue with other elites around the world. But we also sort of see this kind of vision of some of the frivolity that might sit around a place that we kind of think of in such dour religious terms. One of the things about looking at some of these social histories that sit around these religions is that we start to get glimpses of other worlds. And certainly pouring through memoirs, I found a wonderful kind of note in Yaakov Tutakli's memoirs about Hajj Amin Husseini attending Purim, again, in this sort of nexus of spring festivities, this Jewish festival where you would get dressed up as sort of an analogue to Halloween, if you like, but dressed as a blonde woman. And so, when we're starting to think about something like the Dome of the Rock, it has a social life that is so much broader than just this amazing, amazing marvel of a building. And in some ways, when we start tracing this, we can start to understand a whole series more about the cross-communal relations and celebrations at these particular moments in time. To bring it back to some of these questions of craft and the current moment, I wanted to show this work by Dima Srouji, a Palestinian architect and designer. She works a lot with glass. This series of works that she's done, this is one from a series of works that she's done with the glass and window makers who are actually based in Jerusalem at the Haram al-Sharif. And there's a whole tradition behind this. If you look at the facade, as much as there's this amazing tile work, there are also these amazing plaster windows with these glass inserts. The artist, the statement that I'll read you the artist statement because I think it's a very informative one. The work is called Maintaining the Sacred, and she says, on April 15th, 2022, in the course of an incursion into the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem, Israeli forces destroyed 30 coloured glass windows in the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Each window of hand-carved plaster with individually inset pieces of glass takes 6 months to remake. The technique is a dying craft with a few practitioners in Yemen, one in Cairo and another in Jerusalem. The reconstruction of the windows is currently blocked by the Israeli authorities, but it would take 15 years to repair them all. This installation is honour of the history of craft, the worshippers seeking connection with the spiritual world despite the fragility of the space, and to the bodies protecting our public space. I think that this is one of the most beautiful works in the sense that she's working within the fabric of this building, but also trying to think about the crafts traditions that sits around it, trying to think about the lived experience of being in this space, and trying to open that up to a much broader audience through contemporary art. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks very much, David, for the invitation, and I'm glad that you described my talk as being around the Monumental exhibition, because it very much is around. So I began my career as a linguist, so I'm going to start talking very briefly about words before I start talking about pictures. And I want to kick off by reflecting for a moment on the title of the exhibition to which this panel is dedicated, namely Monumental, deriving obviously from the noun monument. And there are various related meanings of the word monument in English. So I shall cite a few of them from the Oxford English Dictionary. So here are a few definitions of the word monument then. I'm not going to read all of them, but the second, third, and fifth, I think, are quite important. So a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. Something that by its survival commemorates and distinguishes a person, action, period, event, etc. Something that serves as a memorial. And then the fifth definition there, a structure, edifice, or in later use also site of historical interest or importance. And you find very similar definitions in French and in German. So there are a few things to note here. I think the first is that the word monument in English signifies two, as in French and German I think, signifies two linked basic meanings. So commemoration on the one hand and historical interest on the other. So the monument is inextricably linked to the past. The second is that this link can be willed, but can also emerge over time in a way that was never intended by the original creators of the structure. And finally, and most importantly for my purposes, the early uses of the word monument all relate to the commemoration of the dead, whereas the idea of historic significance emerges only in the 18th century and is therefore of relatively recent provenance. So if we consider the adjective monumental, we see what I think is a narrowing of the focus to an extent. So while monumental can mean of or relating to a monument or memorial structure, this usage is actually quite rare. In the most common usage, monumental means resembling or suggestive of a monument, especially in being large, solid, or imposing, or in an extended use comparable to a monument in massiveness or permanence, vast, stupendous, great in ambition or scope. So all of this may appear on the face of it to be utterly self-evident and barely worth saying, but it cuts to the heart, I think, of the key questions underpinning the VII Foundation's Monumental exhibition. So what I'd like to do in this short talk is to think about how, when, and why Notre-Dame de Paris became a monument, and what its monumental character means for changing conceptions of, in the words of the exhibition curators, faith, national identity, power politics, social cohesion, colonization, division, and political violence. So I'm going to start with a discussion really of Notre-Dame, and we could argue that the cathedral stands as a monument to the episcopal administration of Bishop Maurice de Sully, who commissioned the cathedral in 1163. If you read Wikipedia, okay, that's the point that Wikipedia starts with. But this is, of course, a post hoc construction. The fundamental purpose of Gothic architecture, of which Notre-Dame is a preeminent example, was not the aggrandizement of its builders, but rather the revelation of the divine. So what did this actually mean for the largely illiterate populace of medieval Paris? Danny Sandron, speaking to National Geographic in January 2022, noted that ordinary people would have experienced the medieval church in a way that was far removed from the experience of Catholic mass-goers today. He writes, so milling about in the chairless nave, they couldn't see and could barely hear the services held by the resident canons 8 times a day behind a wall in the choir. In the side chapels, chaplains whispered some 120 masses per day, but those too weren't really for the living. They were for the affluent dead who had endowed masses in perpetuity in hopes of boosting their souls out of purgatory. Nevertheless, ordinary people flocked to Notre-Dame. They sometimes slept on the floor before an altar, dreaming of miraculous cures for painful diseases. Catholic faith was vital to most French people then. So this raises the question of how the Catholic faith could have become important to a populace that could not hear the masses being read in the cathedral and could not have understood them even if they had been audible, because of course the language of the Mass was not the vernacular but rather Latin. And architecture, I think, provides one answer to this question. So approaching Notre-Dame today, we are confronted, as was the medieval visitor, with the massive west front and its 3 portals. And these portals offer a visual distillation of essential religious dogma. The central portal is particularly explicit in its representation of the Last Judgment, and the portal of the Virgin there stresses also the presence of the Virgin Mary. And what we have to remember, I think, is that in the Middle Ages, these sculptures were vividly painted, which made them both more legible, you could make more sense of them because they stood out more clearly from the relief, and they were also more spectacular. So the portals constitute a literalization of the parallel from the Gospels in John 10 verse 9, I am the door, by me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. So in this way they prepare the worshipper for the experience of the interior, which was then itself an allegory of the heavenly Jerusalem. In his famous outline of European architecture, Nicolaus Pevsner identifies 3 architectonic features that define the Gothic style. And these are pointed arches, flying buttresses, and ribbed vaulting. And Pevsner understands the effects of these from the perspective of the ambulant visitor. So what does these do when you walk into the building? And in his view, Gothic building techniques enabled the construction of spaces that were longer, higher, and wider than their Romanesque predecessors. If you want to see what this looks like in practice, the Église de Saint-Trophime here in Arles is an extraordinarily vivid illustration of the difference between Romanesque architecture, which feels very constrained, and Gothic architecture, which feels light and airy by comparison. So I was just there yesterday, and it is quite fascinating. So Gothic cathedrals were also much lighter in terms of their perceived weight, but also in terms of their degree of illumination. The space was less obviously subdivided into bays, which meant that the eyes and the footsteps of the visitor were guided ever more seamlessly towards the altar and thus towards the most sacred space within the cathedral. There was more to it than this, however. So the apparent weightlessness of Gothic structures meant that their interiors were flooded with diaphanous light. And so the interior of the Gothic cathedral was intended to enable worshippers to see beyond the visible and material world to the heavenly Jerusalem beyond. So the bodily experience of light was deemed to be a gateway to the transcendent experience of divine illumination. So the art historian Bernd Busch notes that this has had two effects. So on the one hand, the majestic manifestations of religious imagination in Gothic architecture responded to ordinary people's need for sensory experience and emotional identification. On the other hand, though, the calculated concretization and the making visible of the specific tenets of Christian faith was an act of cultural colonization in the way that it shaped and guided the emotional lives of the faithful. And even at the time, medieval heretics rebelled against this. They argued that the spectacular nature of religious buildings and ceremony was ultimately a form of propaganda and persuasion. It emancipated the senses only to instrumentalize them for purposes of social control. In fact, this social control was not solely a question of religious doctrine, but of concrete, visible hierarchies. The cathedral's construction instituted a rigorous separation between the choir, which was accessible only to the bishop, the canons, and those responsible for celebrating the liturgy, and the nave, which was accessible to all. And then within the choir, the spatial distribution of bodies was in strict accordance with the rank of those present, from the bishop all the way downwards. So ecclesiastical power was inscribed in the very structure, the decoration, and the spatial layout of Notre-Dame. But so, it turns out, was royal power. So where are we? While not actually planned as part of the original intentions for the cathedral, around 1220, so well before it was complete, it was decided to thin out the masonry above the portals in order to make room for this, the Gallery of Kings. And this is a row of 28 statues that nominally represents the kings of Judah, the Old Testament kings leading up to the birth of Christ. But even in the 13th century, it was interpreted by visitors as representing and exalting the kings of France. So the intimate link between ecclesiastical and royal power was then also underscored by a list of the kings of France, starting with King Clovis in the 6th century, that was affixed to the cathedral doors at around the same time. So Notre-Dame was also rapidly integrated into the legitimating ceremonies of royalty. So each new sovereign stopped at Notre-Dame after his coronation at Reims to give his solemn vow before the bishop and chapter to respect and protect the privileges and liberties of the church in Paris. And furthermore, the north portal, the portal of the Virgin, which we saw earlier on as well, is flanked by statues of the Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, on the left here, and Pope Sylvester I on the right. So in the eyes of medieval spectators, these figures illustrated the virtues of a political system in which royal power and ecclesiastical power were inextricably linked. So if we think then about the power politics encoded in Gothic cathedral architecture at the time of its construction, it wasn't simply a question of awe-inspiring scale, even though cathedrals did clearly dwarf the dwellings and other structures in the medieval city. It was also a question of three further interlinked functions. So the first is the concentrated visual and sensory expression of a univocal understanding of the divinely ordered cosmos. Second, the visible performance of social hierarchies through spatial division and the distribution of bodies. And third, the visual representation of and periodic ceremonial reinforcement of the link between monarchical and ecclesiastical power. The fact that the Gallery of Kings was added in 1220 may actually suggest something more as well. So it falls towards the end of the reign of Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus. And he had won a famous victory at Bouvines in 1214 against a coalition of King John of England, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Dukes of Flanders and Burgundy. This had massively strengthened the power and prestige of the French Capetian monarchy within Europe. And during his reign, Philip Augustus also brought large areas of French territory under the direct or indirect control of the French crown. So you can see the impact of his various wars and campaigns of conquest here on these two maps, where the blue and green areas are in direct or under direct or indirect control of the French crown, and that's how the political geography of France changed during Philippe Augustus's rule. Philippe Augustus was also the first monarch to style himself King of France rather than King of the Franks. And this ostensibly minor change in nomenclature, I think, actually represented quite a decisive shift that mapped the monarchy not onto a people, the Franks, but onto a territory, France. So the political ties between church and crown, symbolized by Notre-Dame, were from the very beginning inextricably linked to the drive towards a unified, centralized French nationhood. Notre-Dame, though, fulfilled these functions not as a monument, but as a living building. It was a building for use. But it's important to note, I think, that its effects of power depended on visuality, on making specific visual and sensory experiences available to the faithful. I'm now going to fast forward 6 centuries because I have neither the time nor the knowledge to kind of walk us through the history of Notre-Dame between 1163 and 1850. But the question I want to think about now is how modernity inflects the function and role of Notre-Dame. And the specific features of modernity I'd like to concentrate on are, first of all, political democracy, secondly, the secularism that brings with it, at least in the French context, and thirdly, the emergence of the technical media. And then I'll try to tie these things back to the questions underpinning the Monumental exhibition, which, just to remind ourselves, are faith, national identity, power politics, social cohesion, colonization, division, and political violence. Just as a little trailer, I'll have very little to say about colonization per se, but something that will emerge in the course of this talk is that national identity, as it is conceived by the French preservation movement, is absolutely metropolitan. It is concerned with l'Hexagone, it is not concerned with the Département Outre-mer, and it is not concerned with empire. Okay, so the French Revolution of 1789 led to quite profound changes in the function of ecclesiastical architecture. Amid the violent upheavals, Notre-Dame de Paris was severely damaged. The Gallery of Kings was dismantled, again by revolutionaries who, like their medieval forebears, thought that these were representations of the kings of France, not the kings of the biblical Old Testament. Destruction and looting of royal, aristocratic and church property was widespread, and in 1794, Abbé Grégoire quite famously coined the term vandalism to designate this kind of hostile act against property. Church property had been nationalized in 1789, meaning that the French state now bore urgent responsibility for its safeguarding and its upkeep. And the new body charged with this task was quite tellingly called the Commission des Monuments, so the Commission for Monuments. And by invoking, therefore, the relatively new usage of monument to designate a structure or the edifice of historical interest or importance, the Commission des Monuments recategorized royal and religious buildings, not as living embodiments of power, but effectively as patrimoine, as cultural heritage. And this was quite a crucial move, because the reassessment of the monarchical and ecclesiastical past was vital for legitimizing the newly democratic French Republican state. In short, France needed to reimagine its own history in ways that rejected affirmative narratives of dynastic continuity and political Catholicism. So when the aforementioned Abbé Grégoire declared in a report to the Commission des Monuments that French Gothic was one of the most daring conceptions of the human spirit, he effectively stripped away the theological significance and the political instrumentality of cathedral architecture. So no longer linked to a specific faith community or to a specific political elite, the architectural achievements of the past, especially French Gothic architecture, became the universal patrimony of the French nation. Abbé Grégoire's pronouncements quoted above about vandalism and about the human spirit, I think, imply two complementary aspects to the preservation movement in post-revolutionary France. The first was concerned with the safeguarding and restoration of buildings that were deemed to be both historically important and also at risk. The second was concerned with constructing a kind of imaginative historical geography of the French nation based on ecclesiastical, royal and aristocratic buildings that were now, as it were, reclassified as historic monuments. In contrast to other European countries, historic preservation in France was notable for its high degree of centralization and state coordination, which began in the 1790s and continued throughout the 19th century. So across various state agencies in France, museum experts, archaeologists, cartographers and historians set about collecting, documenting, re-evaluating the materials of the French past and then putting them on display. And central to these projects was image making in the form of drawings, paintings, engravings, lithographs, and maps. I think the invention of photography then massively expanded the potential role of images in the advancement of the preservation agenda. So from the point of view of architectural restorers, detailed records of the condition of buildings, their construction methods and distinctive features were essential prerequisites to the work of conservation and reconstruction, and photography, particularly if you think about the detail of the daguerreotype, could accomplish this task with a level of speed and accuracy that were completely beyond normal human capabilities. But then from the point of view of patrimoine, disseminating photographs of historical monuments was part of a broader ongoing effort to produce national unity and thereby social cohesion by exposing viewers repeatedly to artifacts from the shared past. So historian Susan Crane notes that visiting museums or historical sites forces one to participate, however momentarily, in the public that is constituted by this shared historical knowledge. And the same applies to viewing photographs, of course. You know, monuments of the past could be displayed in ways that reminded the French public of its common collective heritage. But because photographs can circulate and make geographically disposed sites available for visual consumption anywhere, they reinforce this sense of national belonging on a much more regular basis than museum or sightseeing visits. So in saying all this, I've tried to think about the emergence of the historic monument in post-revolutionary France, the role of these monuments in constituting a new national past, and then the slightly later importance of photography as an indispensable adjunct to this nation-building project. And in the final part of this talk then, I'd like to return to Notre-Dame de Paris, looking at its 19th century history before concluding with some comments on Tomas's monumental photographs that surround us now. So as I mentioned earlier, Notre-Dame de Paris was sacked during the French Revolution and for several years was used as a warehouse. It was restored to the Catholic Church under the terms of the Concordat of 1801 between the Holy See and Napoleon. And as it says on the panel over there, I think Napoleon crowned himself emperor in the cathedral in 1804. By the end of the Napoleonic era, however, Notre-Dame had fallen into a state of advanced disrepair and was subject to further vandalism as well as an arson attack in the revolutions of 1830. So its condition ended up being so parlous that demolition was seriously considered by the municipal authorities. According to popular belief and many a website, publication of Victor Hugo's Notre-Dame de Paris, known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, in 1831, was responsible for drawing public attention to the building's significance and also for reigniting then French enthusiasm for Gothic architecture. What we know for sure is that Hugo was a tireless campaigner for the preservation of French architecture, and he used a language that was entirely in line with the argument that I've been making about monuments and the nation. So this is a quotation from a letter that he wrote to the Revue des Deux Mondes in 1832. And he says, what we're actually suggesting, therefore, is that in France, right now, there is perhaps not a single village, a single capital of an arrondissement, a single main town of a canton, where the destruction of some historic national monument is not being planned, begun, or completed. So for Hugo, as for many of his compatriots, conservation of historic buildings was very much seen as a question of preserving the national past. The campaigns to which he contributed eventually led to the lengthy, expensive, and very controversial restoration work done under the auspices of Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. The restoration of Notre-Dame then took place more or less simultaneously with the so-called Haussmannization of Paris. So Baron Haussmann was the prefect of the Seine under Napoleon III, and he masterminded the large-scale transformation of Paris throughout the 1850s and 1860s. He destroyed old neighborhoods by driving expansive arterial boulevards through the city. Many of these old neighborhoods were of medieval provenance, and they just disappeared under the forces of Haussmannization. But in terms of new construction, Haussmann was much less interested in the individual monuments than he was in the street and the kind of circulation that it enabled. But in terms of older buildings and buildings of symbolic importance, so he pursued a policy of dégagement, or disencumberment. So in other words, the isolation of public buildings in space so that they could be clearly viewed. So again, this whole question of visuality comes to the fore. And in the case of Notre-Dame, Haussmann actually quadrupled the size of the parvis, so that flat expanse in front of the cathedral, demolishing the ramshackle dwellings that had previously covered much of the Ile de la Cité. Notre-Dame could thus be viewed across a large expanse of empty space in splendid monumental isolation. So it had always been possible to represent Notre-Dame in that way. You know, if you look at old paintings of Notre-Dame, or even if you look at this photograph by Henri Le Sec from 1860, you do get that sense of the cathedral being there for visual consumption in isolation. What Haussmannization did was turn that from a representational possibility into a lived optical reality. And as we saw earlier, the cathedral's function in the Middle Ages depended on multiple forms of visuality that communicated divine grace and earthly power. As a historical monument, too, its power can't be divorced from its status as visual spectacle. So have I got time to say a few things about the exhibition? Okay, yeah, that's fine. So to come finally to the exhibition that surrounds us, the function of Notre-Dame as a national monument is actually the jumping off point. So that photograph on the panel over there is an anonymous photograph of the cathedral with crowds awaiting the arrival of Général de Gaulle just after the liberation in August 1944. And the interesting thing is that the west front of the cathedral, if you look carefully, is festooned with tricolor flags, and also on the lower of those two, in the lower of those two circles, you can see the insignia of the Free French. So again, we have the cathedral being stage managed as a national monument. But looking at these photographs, I'm also struck by the difference between Tomas's work and photographs of the cathedral's 19th century restoration. So while Henri Le Sec and Gustave Le Gray dwell on masonry yards and imply the labor of individual masons shinning up ladders to repair stonework, Tomas's images, I think, emphasize the colossal scale and technical ingenuity of the project. So just compare those two. And I was going to say something about the wet collodion process, but I think I'll probably run out of time. Restoration itself can be made quite spectacular. as in this image, which foregrounds scaffolding, a huge tower crane, and a level of illumination that constitutes the restoration process as something to be looked at and marveled at. So hand in hand with the emphasis on technology, however, goes a concern with artisanal skill and the sourcing of materials from French quarries and from French forests. So this roof truss, for example, made from French oak using medieval tools and methods, celebrates both the skill of the cathedral's original builders and the persistence of such crafts in the present day. So these two things, the technocratic and the artisanal, I think are very much in line with two ways in which France has understood itself since the 19th century. So on the one hand, a country in which artisanal skill is still prized, on the other hand, as a country that is at the vanguard of technological modernity. One thing that Tomas does, which his 19th century forebears don't, however, is to dwell also on the religious functions of Notre-Dame. So to my knowledge, this kind of photograph showing paintings of biblical scenes and stained glass don't exist in the 19th century record of reconstruction. The ecclesiastical function of the cathedral is not writ large in Thomas's project, I think, and that becomes very obvious if we compare it with Ziyah's work on the Dome of the Rock. But it does gesture towards some interesting aspects of the current Notre-Dame restoration project. So at present, visitor numbers to Notre-Dame say a lot about its significance. It attracts about 3,000 worshippers every Sunday. It also attracts 13 million tourists per annum. So its status as a historic monument massively trumps its status as a devotional site. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the vast preponderance of newspaper reports in the French media stressed the national importance of Notre-Dame rather than its significance for the faith community, the Christian faith community. And of course, Emmanuel Macron's immediate commitment to restoring the building turned the whole question of restoration into a concern of the French state. At the same time, the fact that Macron brought a 5-star general out of retirement might also be telling. So the project has been managed by Jean-Louis Georgelin, who's a retired general. He was not only a retired general there, but also a devout Catholic. So there was an acknowledgement in the way that Macron managed this project that the faith dimension of Notre-Dame could not be entirely ignored. And actually, once the restoration is complete, the intention is to recurate the visitor experience. So people will now be ushered in a new loop from north to south, from darkness to light, through the Old Testament towards the New Testament. And the intention, as Patrick Chauvet, the rector of the cathedral, has put it, is to lead is that visitors will thereby enter progressively into the mystery of God. So this is nothing less, in a sense, than the reanimation of the visual and spatial dimensions of the cathedral to convey a theological message. We are, as it were, back in the Middle Ages. Whether this still works in the 21st century, I think, is definitely something that remains to be seen. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We want to open up to questions, but we also want to invite Tomas and Ziyah maybe just to pull up a chair alongside. You can ask questions of them. They can also, if you guys want to add anything to the conversation immediately, let me know. But let's go to the floor first. Any questions? Savannah over there. We will get a microphone to you. Yes. Do you want to get the second microphone for... Yep.
Thank you very much to you both for that really elucidating, those really elucidating presentations. I feel like I'm at risk of committing that cardinal sin of asking a question that relates to my own research, but I do think it's very relevant because I noticed that you both shared archival images in your presentation, and of course we're surrounded by a couple archival images here as well. And it really made me think about, Sary, is that your name? You mentioned that the British really determined how the city was preserved and which monuments were preserved and which were demolished. And similarly, our second speaker, I'm sorry, I missed your name. Jonathan mentioned how actually photographs can function in memorialization more than sites because they can travel, right? And so I guess I'm just curious about, like, and this is also for the photographers as well, like, how do you see archival images function in this practice of monuments and monumentalization? And yeah, and also what was your maybe experience when you were looking through archival images, as archives are also, you know, sites which are constructed and controlled and which change meaning in the same way that these sites have changed function and social function over time, so do images. So archival photographs, okay, go.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of my research is based on archival photography. I think that the archive is, I mean, it's always a problematic thing. You know, I think archives are prone to reinterpretation. We're prone to seeing things through a contemporary lens. We're prone to seeing things that aren't there. But the other thing that archives can yield, particularly from a sort of a social and cultural histories perspective, is moments that you might not find in textual archives. So for me, I think the archive, I mean, while people like Ariella Azoulay have kind of made an argument for getting rid of the archive altogether as a sort of a forum, I mean, for me, I think the archive is a really important thing, but it's also something that we've got to take in a kind of a critical way. You know, I think one of the things that's so beautiful about Ziyah's photographs is that he shows not just this really spectacular building, but actually a social life that surrounds it, you know. But that social life that exists today is different to the social life that existed 100 years ago, to 150 years ago, to 500 years ago, or even 1,300 years ago. So, you know, I think one of the things about thinking about archives is how we kind of take a critical lens, how we understand the relationship of a photographer to their subject, how we understand the subject's kind of potential will over a photographer, particularly with things like studio photography, or where there's spaces of interaction or commissioning. But, you know, I mean, given the absolute devastation of Palestinian cultural heritage at this moment, I also think that one of the things that's amazing about these archives is that we have records. You know, we have records from particular moments, admittedly with particular biases. But, you know, I mean, this is an important thing if we're thinking about revitalising these spaces. And certainly there's a lot of groups springing up at the moment in the heritage sector that are looking at reconstruction of cultural heritage. But even in other spaces, back in Jerusalem, say, you know, the Wiesenthal Museum of Tolerance is being built on a cemetery that was, you know, dating from the Byzantine era, with all of these amazing Sufi links said to contain members of, you know, the Prophet Muhammad's, you know, circle, with all of these Sufi resonances. So how, you know, I mean, I think this is where, you know, the archive becomes a valuable thing in terms of preserving these sorts of materials.
During the process of creating this work, of course, I became interested in Notre-Dame, and not just how it is today, but how it's been represented over the ages. And the archives of Notre-Dame are so ubiquitous that once you've seen it, you can't really unsee it, basically. I mean, they are just everywhere. If you go back, of course, it's mostly religious representation that you see, but since photography is after the French Revolution and after the secularization of the state, there's almost no religious photography compared to the proportion of everything else. So as Jonathan was saying, you have a lot of photography that has this sort of architectural preservation behind it as a motivation, and then you have Paris as a place that's a place of inspiration for artists and very welcoming for artists. So you have artists producing this work and a birthplace of photography. So the very first picture of a monument, as far as I can tell, in the world is of Notre-Dame itself by Daguerre. And then you have, I would say today, Paris, for lack of a better word, is sort of like, driven by this tourism industrial complex, and Notre-Dame is kind of the center of this, and just postcards first emanating everywhere in the world, and now selfies emanating everywhere in the world. So it's just constantly represented. You can probably go in any sort of grandma's drawer somewhere in the French countryside and pull out a silk handkerchief or a silver spoon that has Notre Dame's image on it, or an old postcard. So it's completely everywhere. So it was a challenge for me as a photographer, because with something so represented, how do you look at it afresh? And that's where I started asking myself a lot of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really interesting things in the context of photography in the French preservation movement is the way in which largely forgotten archives suddenly become re-evaluated as themselves monuments of French history. And I'm thinking in particular of the Mission Héliographique, which may be familiar to people in the room. So basically in around 1852, 53, I think, the successor to the Commission des Monuments commissioned 5 photographers to travel around France to record historic monuments. So beyond that, the brief was extraordinarily loose. All but one of them used the calotype paper method. So they had improved it by finding ways of waxing the paper, which did give you a slightly sharper image, but the images were still relatively soft. So as evidence of the state of buildings and evidence of structures that needed to be borne in mind when restoring buildings, they were functionally useless. There was also no prescription as to what they should photograph, so they all kind of photographed what they wanted. And then when they brought all of these photographs back to Paris, nothing happened to them. You know, I think only about 2 of them were printed at the time. The rest of them just sat in an archive, and they were rediscovered many, many decades later. They were reprinted, and since then they have been published in numerous anthologies. There is a huge body of scholarship now that relates to that. But the Mission Héliographique has itself become a kind of a monument to a moment in the history of French preservation, as well as replicating this imaginative geography of France that I spoke about earlier on. So I just find the reactivation of archival material and its repurposing at a later date is quite an interesting phenomenon.
Ziyah, did you want to say anything about choosing archives? Okay. Bruce, question.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your time and for your insights today. This question is mostly for Thomas and Ziyah. For all of us, but especially for the students in the room, can you talk a little bit about what you learned about representation, but also actually about how you went about doing this project, things that you learned through that might impact if you were doing this similar type of project in the future? Thinking about how students could learn from you and the way you approach projects.
I would certainly do it differently, but that's always the problem. So that's what I learned. But that more refers to my practice as a photographer rather than anything else. So that would be the takeaway for students. What was the first part of the question? Can you just?
Well, just what you learned about representation and producing a project.
Right. Well, in this particular case, I was well aware of 2 things. One, the intended audience, if you like, or the publication that is going to use this work, and that comes with certain burden, if you like, and also with reality of that place, which is very different compared to Notre-Dame. Just as a number, you know, there's barely any tourists there, but there's like 150,000 people a day praying there, a few times a day. So just, you know, so the function of the place is actually not completely, but very, very different than Notre-Dame. So I had to be aware of those sensitivities, and obviously the place is sort of on a daily basis is also a place of conflict, if you like. I wouldn't say daily, but like every Friday, so almost daily. So those are the things that I had to bear in mind all the time. On one end of the story is what is the intended audience and client, and on the other hand is the reality of the place. So, yeah.
So I guess before representation, just the first thing I would say to a student is that the access was more important than the photography in a sense, and I probably had a 10-to-1 effort and time invested in access ratio to actually taking the photographs, and I would consider that as maybe not a baseline, but quite often, if you want to photograph something important and it hasn't been photographed yet, or it's in a situation like Notre-Dame during the rebuilding that access is restricted, then most of your efforts will be in that and not in the photography itself. After that, for the representation itself, as soon as I was on the subject, I got very, very interested in the archives, like I said, and so I was looking as a photographer to sort of riff off what had already been put on the visual record, what was already in our mind's eye. So that is why I decided to use wet plate collodium for part of this. There's a huge parallel, which is I was photographing the restoration of the cathedral, and in the middle of the 19th century, as Jonathan said, there was a big restoration of the cathedral. The spire was rebuilt by Viollet-le-Duc, and that was exactly at the same time that wet plate collodion was on the scene. So I could sort of draw a parallel between these two periods, and in fact, if you look in the book, I have a picture without the spire and with the spire taken during the restoration during the 19th century, and then here, when they put it back up after the projection thing is up, I have pictures with and without the spire. So there is sort of some kind of multi-generational continuity that photographers are engaged in when you're photographing something that's existed over time and been represented over time. After that, the one other thing I would say is that there's a lot of stakeholders, and it's quite hard. I think you have to make a real effort to hold on to your own authorship and vision in a project that's much bigger, in my case, than me, than all of us. You know, National Geographic's a huge client. Symbolically, the cathedral means a lot to the French state. And yet I have my own personal opinions about Notre-Dame, and everybody's trying to pull me in this and that direction. So, you know, making sure that your authorship is not crushed by bigger interests and holding on to your voice. At the end of the day, you want something that you can be proud of in the long term and not just delivering to clients or feeding whatever, you know, is needed by the communication officers of the moment.
Oh, Bruce, you can have another one.
Do you have any stories you could share about the people who saw the work once it was done? Anyone, Ziyah, you shared with me one story that was quite moving.
Well, the one that is kind of interesting is actually raised that picture at the end, which is quite rarely taken. Not so much because it's physically inaccessible, although it is not easily accessible, but because the area of Al-Aqsa compound is incredibly heavily monitored, surveilled, and also you have a presence of Israeli police there. And to get there means being very exposed, and that they see you, they don't like that. So there's a lot of, as Tomas mentioned, there's, you know, most of the time went into negotiation to get something done in a few minutes. But that particular picture, once I taken, because of that picture is rarely seen actually. And so in fact, the people that take care of Al-Aqsa compound, the Waqf, the endowment, they don't have it. And you know, they actually have a photographer. And so once, as a gesture of goodwill, I printed that picture and gave it to the director of the endowment, which has been director for like 50 years, and he's never seen that. So he works next to this place, but he has never seen it from that perspective. So that was quite impressive, and so that kind of felt good. But that's the one I would sort of bring up, other than less pleasant ones. But that one, yeah.
Well, I'll make your lives easy, so you can just see the photograph right next to it from Notre-Dame. The two kind of sit well together because they have this circular shape. But one of the problems of photographing Notre-Dame is every single corner of it has already been photographed or represented in some way, and we all hold it in our mind's eye. Many people have visited, except for this view. And so in my case, it's the view straight down, the hole at the exact center of the cathedral that the spire collapsed through onto the altar, leaving this gaping gash at the very heart of the cathedral. That's one view that nobody has ever seen before and perhaps will never see again because it's already been filled up. the new spire is there. So it was just a very specific historical moment and this very specific view right at the very epicenter of it. And so that one, when people see it, it's the one that it's abstract or they haven't noticed, whatever, they can't imagine it enough that they don't know what it is at first, and it takes a while for them to figure it out. And so I get a lot of questions and commentary about that particular one.
Anyone other than Bruce? No? Well, great. Thank you very much. I really want to thank Sary and Jonathan for the time and effort they put into the presentations and providing context for this, and also Ziyah and Thomas for participating, and obviously for the work itself. And you, thank you very much for coming.